Miraj. I am one of the university trainers that they would have mentioned this morning. I am from the Department of Economics, from the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I have been selected to present to you today on the water resources sector. Now, full disclaimer, I am not a water resources expert, in no way. As you heard, I am from the Department of Economics, which makes me essentially an economist. So the question is, what am I doing presenting to you, who I presume are the experts in the water resources sector, or probably have more experience than I do in the water resources sector? Who am I to be presenting to you? And to be honest, it is about collaboration, so that I would really be drawing upon your experience, your knowledge, your expertise, with the hope that this training module, this training section is enhanced by your input, so that we know through collaboration what is the best content and approach that we can develop so that this particular module meets the needs of the water resources sector in terms of climate change and in terms of adaptation policies that best fit the water resources sector. And before we move on, therefore, I would just like to get some feedback from you in terms of what was presented this morning and what you see the objective of your participation today to be. It helps doing this so that we have an idea throughout my presentation as to what each element represents. The bigger picture, sort of like a roadmap. So why are you here today? I mean, yes, you would have gotten an invitation. You would have received an email. I think it would have come from Candace. And what do you understand to be your purpose, your presence? Anyone? One word, two words, anything that comes to mind in terms of the objective of the workshop, the objective of the entirety of this project. Anyone? Yes? Very good. So we're talking about climate change, I'll abbreviate, and data collection. And we're looking at it from a holistic point of view. So we want to capture as much information about climate change and holistically. And when we speak about this holistic perspective, we're meaning that we want to capture it from all types of stakeholders. So we're looking at it from, of course, your governmental perspective, the ministers who we will be meeting with tomorrow, or their permanent secretaries, but the practitioners, the non-governmental organizations, academia. And at some point in time, we will have that interaction with media, and certainly we would want the interaction with persons on the ground beyond civil society, those that civil society organizations represent. So overall, we are speaking about climate change, yes, which is the big picture, but we are focusing on the impacts of climate change on the water resources sector. This is our special group here. Downstairs, we have the health sector. Yesterday, we spoke about the impacts of climate change on agriculture. And on Tuesday, we dealt with the impacts of climate change as it relates to the energy and transport sector. So it all comes together in terms of looking at Trinidad and Tobago's response to climate change. Now, beyond that as well, we know one of the main challenges that everyone faces at a national level, at a regional level, at a global level, is that of limited resources. If we had unlimited resources, we wouldn't be here. We would be able to snap our fingers and solve all problems. The fact of the matter is that we have certain challenges that we would review in terms of what climate change poses to us, but we have limited resources with which we need to grapple with to solve these challenges, to adapt to these challenges, to mitigate the issues related to these challenges. So how best do we make decisions in terms of utilizing these limited resources in the best manner possible? So we have priorities. Health would say their priorities are more important than water. Economic priorities are the most important. I'm an economist, so I will say that, right? But then they're all interlinked. You cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy population. You cannot have a healthy population with proper water resources. You cannot have a healthy population or a healthy economy without proper food or food security. So the complexity of climate change impacts makes it necessary for us to recognize the interconnectedness between all of these sectors, so that when we develop policies, these policies are suitable, they are appropriate, and they represent the interests of as many stakeholders as possible. So ultimately, when we utilize climate finance, which is essentially what we use to represent the resources committed towards climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, when we utilize climate finance, we get the best bang for our buck. We get the most out of it. And that's essentially what all of this is about. And this initiative is essentially one example in terms of capacity building that allows us to utilize climate finance in such a way so that we are hoping that later on it develops a more resilient, a term that you might have heard this morning, population, by building capacity in terms of our awareness and our ability to assess Trinidad and Tobago's performance with regard to climate change. So that's a big picture, and that's how it's feeding into today's presentation. Let's start with really understanding the water resources sector, which, as I said, many of you would know more than I do in terms of your personal experience, your professional experience, perhaps part of maybe WASA. Anyone here from WASA? See, I knew that. So I'm certain many of you would have more experience in terms of that sort of knowledge. I understand some IMA representatives. So some of this would be already known, but we would review it because, again, in terms of having a strategic approach to managing a resource, we still need to understand the nature, the characteristics of that resource, and then move forward to understand what we're dealing with in terms of the climate change impacts on that resource. So we're going to explore the water resources sector in terms of what it represents, what it is in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and what are the key climate change impacts on the water resources sector globally, and then zoning into the Trinidad and Tobago's experience. And then we're going to look at adaptation as it relates to the water resources sector, again from a broad perspective, and then zoning in again into Trinidad and Tobago's experience. Now, just to also let you know, we have Daniela joining us from Canada, so she is in virtually, so she is also going to be supporting the presentation and part of the Q&A section at the end. Now, we have the water cycle, which I think you know, many of you would be familiar with, but I would like to highlight something that is of key importance, which is the fact that while Water covers 71% of the Earth's surface. Only 2% of this is fresh water. And what I also found quite interesting in this information is that the scarcity of fresh water is important because it is not just that we assume that it is always available, but the water cycle establishes an equilibrium in terms of demand and supply. And this equilibrium situation is being challenged by human impacts as well as climate change impacts. So this 2% of water upon which we are dependent on for survival, for all human activities, is being affected by human drivers in terms of the demand side, but also by climate drivers in terms of affecting the supply side. So we cannot take it for granted that while water covers 71% of the Earth's surface, that it is there and always readily available without proper management. In terms of assessing climate change impacts, there are different degrees to which we can track how climate change affects human activities. There is, first of all, understanding what climate change is in terms of the physical changes in the climate. And based on those physical changes in the climate system itself, there are also physical changes in terms of our natural environment. So we have increased atmospheric moisture and precipitation, for example, associated with climate change. There are changes in global drought patterns. There are also changes in other factors such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, which are all physical changes in the natural environment associated with climate change. But because of those physical changes in the natural environment, we have other changes taking place in terms of our human environment, in terms of our human and economic systems. So you have drivers of changes in the water cycle being driven or being led by climatic and non-climatic drivers, which would lead to changes in the main components of your water cycle. And because of those interrelationships, so you have your climatic changes leading to changes in your natural environment, which leads to changes in your human environment, which may come back to lead to changes in your climatic environment. So it is interrelated and it is quite complex. And therefore, when we map out these changes, it suggests that there is this complex interrelationship between natural and human-induced processes. I like to sort of describe it as an interface between human and environment, human systems and environmental systems, where it's almost like a feedback loop. We affect the environment, and the environment affects us. And then we respond and affect the environment again, which comes back. So it's almost like that sort of feedback loop interface. And what we are seeing here is that in terms of our water resources, the findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report is that there are certain challenges associated with that interrelationship. So for example, we would expect, or we are experiencing challenges involving increased flood risks, longer dry periods, uneven water distribution. And I think that is a reality that we are aware of in Trinidad and Tobago. And based on these interactions, these human interactions that we have with the environment, we can understand why we are experiencing these challenges right now. Particularly for small island developing states, these interactions, or not really interactions, these impacts, in fact, tend to be exacerbated. It is exacerbated because small island developing states have heightened vulnerabilities. That concept of vulnerabilities was actually introduced this morning. And when we look at the graphic in front of you, we are actually focusing on 3 categories of small island developing states. So you have the AIMS, which look at the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, small island developing states, and then you have Pacific Islands, and then you have the Caribbean. So the innermost circle in the graphic represents Caribbean SIDS, Caribbean Small Island Developing States. And what it is showing is that 59% of the water-related issues in the Caribbean are due to storm events, while 34% of water-related issues in the Caribbean are due to flooding events, while 7% of water-related issues are due to drought events. So we are seeing here that direct relationship between climate-related events, storm, flooding, droughts, and water-related issues. So the impact of climate change on water resources is actually not uniformly distributed across the globe. For low and middle income countries, the issue is worse. And for small island developing states, it is also quite exacerbated. So in the Caribbean, additional warming by 0.2 degrees to 1 degree Celsius could lead to drier, predominantly drier regions with 5 to 15% less rain than present day levels and greater occurrence of droughts. And I think we're saying could lead to, but certainly we are experiencing that. We have experienced that in the earlier part of this year, so we understand that it's not something that we are anticipating, but it is something we are experiencing right now. How many of you are familiar with this acronym, WASH services? All right, so again, first time I was introduced to it, so again, learning as well. I understand that the WASH services represents a way of explaining how the water resources sector and human activities are related to each other, specific types of human activities in particular. So when we look at water challenges and its impact on socioeconomic activities, we can actually describe that as water sanitation and hygiene services, abbreviated as WASH services, insofar that these challenges are intertwined with socioeconomic impacts which affect food security, health, economic stability, and conflict. So climate change directly impacts these water resources and the availability of WASH services. So for example, a 2 degrees Celsius global temperature rise could lead to coastal flooding affecting up to 10 million people, while a 4 degrees Celsius rise could result in a 50% decrease in water availability in East Africa and the Middle East. As of 2022, 2.2 billion people lacked access to safely managed drinking water, while 3.4 billion persons did not have access to safely managed sanitation services. These statistics underscore the urgent need for concerted efforts to improve WASH infrastructure and accessibility, particularly in the face of climate change. So what we're talking about is a situation where access to these services are already challenged, particularly in the developing world, particularly in small island developing states. On top of which now you have climate change, which is exacerbating that challenge, which is making it even more difficult for persons who already have a lack of access to be able now to even access it further. It is restricting the resources. It is creating conditions that is making it even more difficult for these basic services to be accessible by those who are most vulnerable as well. I think this was an important part to also note. The impact on sanitation processes and hygiene behaviors has received less attention than other aspects to date. It does not mean, however, that they are less vulnerable or less impacted by climate change. It's just that we tend to focus less on sanitation and hygiene. So this table describes a little bit more detail of how we trace the climate change impact along with the hazard to the actual impact on the wash sector. I know it is quite small, so let's zoom in. So it's just a sample really, so that you see how we connect the climate change impact in terms of the physical impact to the environmental impact, where the hazard is created, to the socio-economic impact, and we then are able to categorize it. Now this is important because, again, if we are trying to come up with a solution, if we are determining what can be done, we have to start with an understanding of what is happening. What are the impacts? How do we categorize and measure the impacts? And by doing so, we are able to determine the most appropriate solution. So in this case, if we were to now observe the wash sector, we can identify the climate change impact, the hazard that is created by the climate change impact. In this example, a decrease in precipitation would lead to droughts. And because of that, in terms of the wash sector, we see that there would be a reduction in surface and groundwater resources, reduced aquifer recharge, increased water demand, etc. Similarly, if we were to observe the climate change impact of increase in precipitation and severe weather, the hazard associated with that being flooding would create the impacts of pollution of water resources, inundation of water sources, inaccessibility of water points and pumping stations, etc. So this is just an example. I mean, of course, doesn't mean that these are all of the types of impacts and all of the hazards created, but it's an example of how analysis can take place in a strategic manner when managing or when dealing with the management of the sector itself. Any questions? That's my teacher hat on there. All right, good. Now, just as we have wash services, there is also reference to what, I don't know if my abbreviation sounds too good, I call it WEFE. All right, but it is water, energy, food, and ecosystem services. So the water, energy, food, and ecosystem nexus builds upon the recognition that water, energy, and food are intrinsically linked. So water resources are used for energy production, such as hydropower, cooling, and thermal power plants. We will actually discuss that in a bit in more detail, so the water and energy linkage. And as well, food production relies heavily on water for irrigation and energy for processing, transportation, and agricultural machinery. This interconnectedness can lead to trade-offs. So for instance, increased water use for agriculture can impact hydropower generation. Conversely, expanding energy production from fossil fuels can exacerbate water scarcity through cooling processes. So the water, energy, food, and ecosystems nexus framework emphasizes the need for integrated and coordinated management strategies. And again, this highlights the fact that water resources are not infinite. So when we do commit water resources towards use in one sector, we have to bear in mind that there is an opportunity cost associated with that. So dedicating our water resources towards energy or industries means taking away resources from agriculture or other use. So at every point in time, that decision-making process has to be well informed. So a little more elaboration in terms of the impacts on irrigation and food production. So we can see here that the disruption of the hydrological cycle due to climate change will pose a significant threat on food production. So increased and recurring extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods, will stress ecosystems and will have consequences for food security at a national scale and at a global scale. In the Caribbean and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, where we consume what we do not produce and we produce what we do not consume, we know that food security definitely will be affected. We import quite a lot of our food, so at a global scale, if global food security is compromised, it will have implications, especially where we import quite a lot of our food. Agriculture and irrigation, in fact, account for the most significant proportion of consumptive water use globally, representing 60 to 70% of total water withdrawals. One of the most concerning consequences of climate change for agriculture is the increased frequency and severity of droughts. Droughts deplete soil moisture, creating physiological impacts, and of course, flooding as well will compromise the agricultural sector and affect food production. Climate change also significantly affects water requirements for energy and industry. With both observed and projected impacts of droughts and other extreme events showing high confidence in these effects, we see that globally the production of both hydropower and thermal power has been negatively affected by these conditions. In small island developing states and the Caribbean, the impacts of climate change on energy generation are particularly pronounced. Many of these regions are heavily reliant on imported fossil fuel for energy generation. So we know about things like that, right? We have it nice. We sit pretty when it comes to that. But for these other islands, it makes them vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and price volatility. The Caribbean experiences frequent extreme weather events such as hurricanes and tropical storms, which can severely damage energy infrastructure. So for example, Hurricane Maria in 2017 devastated Puerto Rico's power grid. It left the entire island without electricity and caused prolonged power outages. Such events highlight the vulnerability of energy systems in the region to climate-induced disruptions. We're zoning in now from that global perspective to that of our national circumstance. So in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, and this is where your input may correct me if I'm wrong, so this is where your knowledge and expertise may fit in and fill some gaps. There are 55 watersheds in Trinidad, 15 in Tobago. Our watersheds in Trinidad include the Caroni, which is a major contributor of Trinidad's potable water supply, and Urapooch rivers in the Northern Basin, the Navit River in the Central Range, and Southern Basin, which encompasses the River Swamp. In Tobago, the Hillsborough River is the principal water source for Scarborough and Southwest Tobago. The surface water availability per capita in Trinidad and Tobago is approximately 2,200 cubic meters per year per person, meaning that Trinidad and Tobago is not a water scarce country when compared to international standards. Does that sound about okay? All right, so I'm getting some validation. That is, the international criterion for water scarcity is less than 1,000 cubic meters per year per person. Historically, groundwater provided a significant portion of Trinidad's municipal water supply. In fact, groundwater accounts for up to 60% of the total rainfall received in some areas, underscoring its importance as a freshwater source. However, recent surface water infrastructure developments have reduced the dependency on groundwater for municipal water supply purposes to around 25%. Challenges persist in water management due to a limited understanding of aquifer parameters and inadequate groundwater modeling, as hydrological studies are essential for tailored water resource management strategies. So when we connect now, as we were doing at a global scale before, the climate change impacts with our physical impacts and specific impacts on the water resources sector, we are seeing that consistency in terms of how climate change impacts are affecting the water resources sector. So Trinidad and Tobago faces a complex array of water resource management challenges, and we are seeing pollution, unsustainable development, and the impacts of shifting climate conditions affecting the water resources sector, as they are also affecting it on a global scale. Rapid urbanization and industrialization have left lasting marks on freshwater ecosystems, contributing to marshland degradation and heightened pollution levels. Environmental degradation, fueled by activities like quarrying, deforestation, and inadequate waste disposal, compounds issues such as soil erosion, landslides, and flooding, which further strains fragile ecosystems. Water pollution, stemming from malfunctioning wastewater treatment facilities, indiscriminate pesticide, herbicide usage, and industrial discharges, threatens both aquatic and human life. Ecosystem degradation, particularly in wetlands and coastal areas, underscores the urgent need for conservation measures amidst mounting pressures from urban expansion and unsustainable land use practices. All of which to really say, I think, which many of us know already, is that we tend to have a more reactive sort of culture when it comes to management and the management of our resources, where we, and I remember hearing this, and I think it's very, very appropriate. We have this mentality that if one good, two better. So when it comes to pesticide use, you know, you have the instructions, they say use one. But we say if one good, two better. The same thing with fertilizer use. So, you know, there is that sort of social construct that we tend to follow, where we deal with the problem afterwards. You cross that bridge when you meet it. And because of these unsustainable practices, we have indeed mismanaged our water resources. And added to that, the climate change impacts have created an even greater problem, which now requires that we solve the problem, but it has exacerbated, as I keep saying, the vulnerabilities within the sector that has now made it even more compromised and more necessary for us to, you know, take action. And I think this, in a sense, sort of solidifies that importance. So the modeling that was introduced this morning in the presentation spoke of general circulation models, GCMs and RCMs, for example. And using these models, we're actually seeing a grim picture of worsening climate conditions for Trinidad and Tobago, and it's summarized in this slide. So you're seeing these changes and anticipated changes in terms of a decrease in annual rainfall. So if I were to zoom in, I know it's pretty small. A decrease in annual rainfall of between 22% and 30%, yes. But then you have a variation in monthly rainfall between minus 42 millimeters to positive 7 millimeters, suggesting that you would have drier periods, but within those drier periods, you will have periods of intense rainfall, which is essentially what we, again, have been experiencing. So it's almost extremities. When it's dry and hot, it's very dry, very hot. But when it rains, it pours. And with that, we can anticipate that there is going to be a grim picture of worsening climate conditions, as I said, but it is going to have significant implications for water resources. So these climate changes will create risks on water resources, which translate into economic threats and will impact on, yes, the economy, the broader economy, our GDP, our fiscal resilience, how much we have to borrow, but also on our lives, our day-to-day lives. So as related to that last slide and continuing that assessment of how we are going to be affected, we see that Trinidad and Tobago has already experienced substantial economic losses due to climate-induced disasters. And this is us still boasting that we are God's country, yeah? You know, we always, you know, wipe that worry every time we hear of a tropical storm or a hurricane, because we tend to be spared of that immediate impact, but yet we still experience significant impacts when there are flooding events, and we still experience substantial economic losses due to climate-induced disasters. So for instance, the consecutive flooding events from 2017 to 2019 prompted payouts from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF, with the 2018 floods causing over $3.7 million US in infrastructure damages. That's from the flood events in 2018. And based on this table, we can expect that projected damages from hurricanes and sea level rise could escalate to billions of dollars by the end of the century. Now imagine this in light of already having high debt to GDP ratios. Right? And again, I said that, you know, as an economist, these are things we also consider. It's as if we have a credit card bill that you're owing. And every month you get paid, and the first thing you have to do is pay some money on that credit card bill. And bam, you get sick. You get in an accident, something happens. How do you prioritize? So it's the same implication for us as an economy. And in the Caribbean, for certain other Caribbean islands, it's worse, where they have debt to GDP ratios over 100%. So every time they earn $1, they have to pay back $1 plus. So when you are in these compromising situations, and then you have to deal with a hurricane, a flood, then it again creates a dire situation in terms of your priorities, your developmental priorities, because you still have to think about healthcare, education, crime. And then you're trying to repair whatever you can repair because of a hurricane. So if we now understand the nature of the problem, we have identified it, we see what our situation and context looks like, how do we address these challenges? Well, we started We started by understanding the nature of the problem. It's as if we're a doctor and we're trying to deal with a patient, right? And of course, when you're dealing with a patient, you always go into the history. You always try to find out about the patient. What are your risks? What is your lifestyle like? Your diet? So it's the same thing. So we are going to deal with it by first of all looking at the risk assessments. So we want to know what we're dealing with. We carry out comprehensive adaptation plans. So it's important that we develop plans that are best suited to our context. Adaptation plans for Trinidad and Tobago will definitely be different from adaptation plans for Guyana or Jamaica or Barbados or the United States or other European countries, because our circumstances, natural environment, economic circumstances, social circumstances are different. So by understanding these contexts, then we develop adaptation plans that are crafted and suitable. So that is why the assessments are important. So we know who we are, and then we craft these adaptation plans that are appropriate. It must involve empowerment of stakeholders, including not just getting you to say this is what we're doing, but involving you in the process. So stakeholder engagement and collaboration is key to effective adaptation planning. Undertaking an integrated approach, ensuring that there is that identification of the nexus for water consumption, energy generation, food, ecosystem, hygiene. So we want to capture that interconnectivity of sectors. Evidence-based decision-making, which will actually be discussed in more detail in the second part of the presentation, because we talk about monitoring and evaluation. So we want measurements now. Flexibility and adaptive governance, being able to always come back to the table and say, this is working, this isn't working, let's build on it, let's adjust, let's fix, and mainstreaming. Now, in terms of operationalization, after, we've said all of these things, how do we put into play all of these plans, all of these systems and mechanisms? We have a vulnerability assessment. There is a 2024 draft vulnerability assessment report. It was mentioned in the earlier module, and this demonstrates the country's efforts in updating its vulnerability information in order to enable effective adaptation. So remember, I did say we need to know where we are. We have to assess ourselves. That is actually done through our draft vulnerability assessment report. And this is an excerpt out of that vulnerability assessment report, where in particular we assess our vulnerability as determined by exposure. So exposure is measured by certain indicators, and then also by vulnerability, which is determined as dependent on sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So in this morning's presentation, there was a generalized overview of what consists of vulnerability and what is resilience, in terms of how they combine to give you an idea of the state of well-being, in a sense, which helps us understand where are we starting off from, what is our starting point. So again, like a patient, before you can prescribe a solution, before you can prescribe a medicine, a medication, you need to understand, what are you allergic to? What have you taken before? What are your strengths? What is your history? Similarly, for the water resources sector, for our concerns, we need to do this vulnerability assessment. What is your exposure? What are the elements that add to exposure? what are the elements of sensitivity? And in addition to sensitivity, what are we strong in terms of adaptive capacity? What will help us in terms of our strengths actually be able to recover, to be able to use adaptation plan to the best of our capacity, the best of our ability. So all of these elements speaks to our analysis, our self-assessment in terms of a vulnerability assessment that will tell us what we can and cannot do. We need to measure. So in terms of carrying out the assessment, it means also measuring using metrics and indicators that help us track and measure and justify what it is that we are relying upon to reflect our circumstances. So if we're saying we are strong, we are weak, we can adapt if we do implement a certain plan. We need to utilize certain measures that will form that foundation to support the decisions that are made. So what we have here is an example of a way of measuring exposure. So this is an example within our risk and vulnerability assessment of how exposure was measured. So in the draft vulnerability assessment report 2024, exposure was measured in the water resources sector by looking at the cubic meters of water available of both surface and groundwater in the country. It was also measured by looking at the number of water management infrastructures and facilities. So this is an example again of what the results were within the sector. So in terms of exposure indicators, we saw that these indicators measured the extent to which elements of the water resources sector, such as surface and groundwater resources and their associated infrastructures, are exposed to hazards such as temperature changes, precipitation, variability, and sea level rise. So we have those three criteria. These elements are measured in terms of the total quantity of water available in the country, which we mentioned earlier, and the number of water management infrastructures and facilities. And of course, you see high, high, high. So this is an excerpt from the findings of that vulnerability assessment report. And then similarly, you would have had an assessment done for other criteria for vulnerability. Remember, we looked at sensitivity and we also had adaptive capacity. So when we look at sensitivity, we would be considering indicators as well, such as the state of water treatment plants, population density, percentage of water in aquifers, and then they would also consider cross-sectoral indicators such as groundwater salinity, variability in drinking water availability, which all speaks to sensitivity within the sector. And by assessing those types of indicators, the results would have then shown again the level of sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and vulnerability to temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise. And again, some of the results here, which have been produced from the draft vulnerability assessment report 2024. So in terms of sensitivity, you would see medium sensitivity for all three criteria, temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise. High in terms of adaptive capacity, which is a good thing, right? And then in terms of vulnerability, medium in terms of temperature and sea level rise, low vulnerability in terms of precipitation. Again, this would be specific to one type of indicator measured. So I mentioned the vulnerability assessment report. In addition to the vulnerability assessment report, there are other supporting documents that would feed into this bigger picture of climate change adaptation within the water resources sector that would be used and that would support the national tracking system and the enhanced transparency framework. These include the National Climate Change Policy, the National Integrated Water Resource Management Policy, as well as the third National Communication. So these are supporting documents, very important supporting documents, that also feeds into our reporting mechanism as it relates to climate change adaptation and the water resources sector. The integrated water resource management, it's essentially a global approach to effective water management. So it is described as not really being a static blueprint, but a dynamic and iterative process adapting to the unique socio-economic, cultural, environmental context of each locality. And within Trinidad and Tobago, as the slide before indicated, we do have a national integrated water resource management policy. Initiatives implemented in Trinidad and Tobago related to this integrated water resource management policy include Adopt a River program. We had a solid waste management partnership, a coastal defenses program. I think there was also a drainage studies in river basins program as well, all of which highlighted best practices or success stories, in a sense, of the implementation of our integrated water resource management policy. Earlier, we also mentioned the nexus of the water resources sector and the and human systems in terms of the WEFE nexus, the water, energy, and food ecosystems nexus, which also informs adaptation policies. So we see that based on the relationship between the water resources sector and these particular uses, there are applications where adaptation mechanisms can take the form of protecting watersheds and restoring wetlands for ecosystem-based management, or solar, wind, and hydropower adaptation plans, which speaks to renewable energy from ecosystems, sustainable agriculture, which speaks to adaptation related to agriculture and water systems, as well as other nature-based solutions for water security. As another example of adaptation within the water resources sector that highlights that relationship between water security and human systems. In Trinidad and Tobago, and this is directly related again to our enhanced transparency framework and the reporting mechanism in terms of tracking what we have been doing and what we will be doing in terms of adaptation to climate change within the water resources sector, we have our National Adaptation Plan. This National Adaptation Plan will feed into our reporting to the Paris Agreement. And in order to do that, we have to utilize a strategic approach by identifying actions within the sector. So if we're looking at the water resources sector, you have certain actions that would be identified. Within the water resources sector, there are divisions or subsectors that have been determined. So this adaptation plan would have been developed. It's existing already. And for each sector, there would be certain subsectors identified. So you would see these subsectors listed out here. And for each subsector, specific strategies identified. So this is an excerpt from the National Adaptation Plan, breaking down the subsectors within water resources, and then for each subsector, the specific number of strategies in terms of how actions would guide the management of water resources for each subsector. So for example, if we were to look at a subsector, for one that we mentioned earlier in terms of integrated water resource management, you would see that under that subsector, you have specific strategies that are tailored to address the challenges that are specific to that subsector. For example, improving and enforcing the water resources master plan in alignment with the integrated water resource management principles. That's a strategy. Prioritizing comprehensive quantification studies for surface water, coastal or marine waters, and groundwater. That's a strategy. National Water Quality Monitoring Program covering all key water sources, a strategy. So 3 strategies related to that specific subsector. Similarly, for the other sectors, you would have specific strategies. Now, after all of this is done, the next step will be, okay, so we have the strategies, what are the actions, and what will tell us that we have actually done something, we have actually moved towards meeting the objectives of these strategies, that this was not just something like, you know, a manifesto that we made promises and that we said, okay, we plan to, but it just remained that way. To ensure that it does not just remain a promise document, we need also certain targets. So you have the target setting and then the measurement of where we are in terms of meeting those targets. The Sustainable Development Goals integrate within that target because, again, it's incorporated in terms of what we have committed towards, and it helps us with that target setting obligation, in a sense, or commitment. And throughout that obligation or commitment, we have, therefore, to monitor and evaluate. And that will actually be presented in the second part. So this actually takes care of the first part of my presentation. And, of course, we will end this part 1